Lethal, volatile, incurable, unstoppable. These are just a few choice words that best describe the green flu virus. Its origins are unknown, the symptoms are beyond deadly, and the fundamental properties of the virus are truly unprecedented. CEDA was fighting a losing battle against a virus that was unlike anything they've ever seen before. The sheer lethality of the green flu makes it one of the deadliest viruses we've seen in fictional media. Understanding a virus of this nature is certainly a challenge, as proven by CEDA's failure to contain it, but the player is given a ton of subtle hints throughout the stories of Left 4 Dead 1 and 2. In this video, I wanted to talk in detail about the green flu virus, from the early stages of the outbreak, the devastating symptoms, and its horrific mutations. There's also a ton of fan theories and speculation surrounding the green flu, and I'll be sure to discuss some of them as we go through the video. There is a lot to discuss. So, without wasting any more time, let's get started. The date is September of 2009. A hospital in Pennsylvania is taking care of an individual with harrowing symptoms. They continue running tests, but despite their best efforts, they still don't have any idea what's wrong with the patient. The Civil Emergency and Defense Agency, or CEDA, was called in to assess the situation. After arriving at the hospital, the severity of the situation begins to dawn on them. The victim was infected with something that was truly unprecedented in its nature, and CEDA began frequent testing to gain a better understanding of what they were up against. Very shortly after, on September 25th of 2009, this virus was announced to the public and given a name, the green flu. Now, let's fast forward about 4 weeks into the future, and the United States is in complete chaos. Cities throughout the East Coast are completely overrun, and thousands upon thousands were slaughtered by the infected hordes. The green flu is a very lethal virus for a long list of reasons, and for this segment of the video, I wanted to focus on two aspects in particular: its volatile method of transmission and its devastating symptoms. In Chapter 1 of Dead Center, you can find this map, showing us how far the infection spread. In just under a month, the virus has completely ravaged the East Coast of the United States. This orange circle also confirms that Fairfield is the epicenter for the infection. The green flu is highly contagious, and to make things even scarier, the virus did not have a consistent method of transmission. To quote the doctor from the Sacrifice comic, the virus defies anything we've ever seen. Sometimes it's airborne, sometimes it's not. It mutates daily. The virus being airborne explains the insanely fast spread of the virus during the early stages of the outbreak, and this is just one method of transmission. Other common methods of transmission are, of course, contact with bodily fluids, infection via contaminated food and water sources, transmission through livestock, and of course, there's the carriers, who essentially act as Trojan horses for the green flu, entering safety zones and unknowingly spreading the green flu to everyone around them. Because of the virus's very high rate of mutation, implementing effective countermeasures was an impossible task, and because of that, the green flu was able to spread throughout the entire East Coast in just under a month. Just to give you an idea of how fast this infection spread, let's take a look at Lewis's flashback found in part 1 of the Sacrifice comic. Lewis can be seen in an office building, looking out towards the city. He then goes to the bathroom and has his first encounter with an infected. After killing his infected coworker, Lewis then returns to the same window, and the city has fallen into complete disarray. In just a couple of minutes, the city of Philadelphia went from business as usual to complete and utter chaos. And if that wasn't bad enough, let's talk about the symptoms. When the green flu was initially discovered, victims reported feeling nauseous, lightheaded, and generally unwell, the standard symptoms you would expect from a flu-like virus. However, very shortly after the green flu's discovery, a devastating development was made. The green flu began its first major mutation, and the victims infected were now turning into zombie-like creatures. The victims at this point would lose all cognitive brain function, relentlessly attacking anybody nearby, and the symptoms would only get worse. Some of these symptoms include extremely pale skin, yellow eyes with hardly visible pupils, hair loss, and in some cases, the infected can be seen bleeding from multiple orifices like the mouth and eyes. This panel in the Sacrifice comic also confirms that the common infected suffer from severe hallucinations. The common infected also have terrible eyesight, and by looking at the game's code, we can actually measure the infected's vision cone and its maximum range. Valve games, like Left 4 Dead, use the Hammer engine, and this engine uses inches to measure in-game distance. When in their idle states and unaware of the survivor's presence, the infected can see about 500 inches, or 12.7 meters ahead of them. If the infected are alerted in any way, this range is increased all the way to 38.1 meters. Important to note that these values will change depending on the time of day. If you're playing a campaign like Dead Center, for example, a map that takes place during the day, the range is increased all the way to 60.96 meters. The eyesight of the infected may be damaged, but their sense of hearing and smell are drastically enhanced. Alarms, explosions, and all other loud noises attract the infected hordes. This has been said and shown multiple times throughout both games. The other method of summoning the infected hordes is of course the boomer bile. If a boomer pukes on a survivor, that survivor will be blinded and swarmed by the infected. We also see this happen in the intro cinematic for Left 4 Dead 1, when Bill wipes the bile on Francis. Very shortly after this happens, the survivors are attacked by a small swarm of infected despite being relatively quiet this entire scene. In Chapter 1 of Dead Center, you can also find this photo of a captured boomer, along with a sticky note that says, "Chemical signal," and bile is aggression trigger. CEDA was able to figure out early on that bile was a key factor in attracting the infected hordes. The common infected, as seen throughout the games, are extremely aggressive, almost animalistic in nature. They can break down doors, shrug off lethal injuries, sprint at very fast speeds, and scale entire buildings. This would seem to suggest that the virus gives the common infected enhanced physical strength and endurance, and while this is certainly a possibility, there is something else that deserves a mention, and that is the insanely weak bodies of the common infected. Allow me to explain in more detail. In Left 4 Dead 2, if you swing a blunt melee weapon at a zombie's head, the skull will be completely destroyed. This includes weapons like the guitar, golf club, and cricket bat. Destroying a human skull with a guitar in a single swing would require an insane amount of force, and there's an even better example found in the Sacrifice comic. During Bill's surgery, a nurse turns into a zombie and attacks the doctor. The man is eventually killed, but during the struggle, we can see him reach into the zombie's mouth and rip her jaw right off her face. In the very next panel, we can see the nurse's jaw loosely dangling before Bill kicks it clean off. Unless you're the Mountain from Game of Thrones, tearing off a human jaw with one hand would, again, require an immense amount of physical force. The most likely explanation is that the virus drastically weakens the bone structure and muscle tissue of the common infected, which explains the overall fragility of their bodies. The common infected are very aggressive, but how do they behave when they aren't relentlessly chasing survivors? Well, if you observe the common infected while in their idle states, you can sometimes find them leaning up against walls, sitting down, throwing up blood, or even fighting each other. Sometimes the infected can be seen grabbing their heads and stomachs, almost as if they're writhing in pain. It's also important to note that while most common infected share similar traits, they are not universally shared. The fallen survivor is a rare example of an infected who will run away from the player instead of attacking them, implying that some of the infected do have a sense of self-preservation despite losing most of their higher brain function. Another example is the Mudmen found in Swamp Fever, who attacks on all fours instead of sprinting. These uncommon infected are just like the normal infected we see in-game, with very small and distinct differences. Most of the time, it boils down to the infected's current attire, like the CEDA hazmat agents or the security guard zombies. However, there are some cases where the uncommon infected show signs of very odd and bizarre behavior, like the aforementioned Mudmen and Fallen Survivor. If it wasn't obvious enough already, the green flu virus is insanely unpredictable, and for this upcoming segment, I wanted to focus on one of the virus's most volatile aspects. In Chapter 5 of No Mercy, you can find this piece of wall graffiti. The survivors in the safe room are discussing how long it takes to turn into a zombie after getting infected. One survivor says it takes 4 days to turn. Another survivor claims it takes 2.5 hours. One survivor even claims he saw it happen in 5 minutes. So, what's the correct answer here? Is it a day? Is it 2 days? Or is it a couple of minutes? Well, let's go into more detail. Throughout the stories of Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, we see multiple instances of infected survivors turning at very different speeds. Just to go over a few examples, the No Mercy helicopter pilot turns about 10 to 15 minutes after picking up the survivors. Based on this evacuation notice found in Chapter 2 of Crash Course, it's obvious that the survivors didn't get very far in the helicopter. If we're taking the church guy at his word, he turned roughly 1 hour after getting bit. To be on the safe side, let's just say anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes, since the church guy is in a very deranged mental state when the survivors find him, and thus his information can be considered unreliable. In the Sacrifice comic, Zoe is having dinner with her parents, Wade and Carolyn. A zombie walks into the room and attacks Zoe's mom, biting her on the face. Zoe then rushes over to the phone to call for help, and in just a matter of seconds, Carolyn turns into a zombie and attacks Zoe's father. Now, yes, it's hard to measure time in a comic, but if I had to give it my best guess, Zoe's mom turned in roughly 30 to 60 seconds. We can see Wade tending to Carolyn when Zoe reaches the phone, so we know this was a very quick transformation. Another example in the Sacrifice comic is Lieutenant Mora. After getting scratched by an infected, Lieutenant Mora is later found by Lewis and Zoe. He can be seen pointing a gun, and he's very obviously infected. Giving it my best guess, Lieutenant Mora turned a couple of minutes after getting scratched. Let's just say 3 to 5 minutes to make it easier. One example that doesn't get talked about enough is the pilot at the end of Dark Carnival. Based on multiple pieces of evidence found throughout the campaigns, we know that Dark Carnival takes place in Griffin, just south of Atlanta. In Chapter 1 of Swamp Fever, an Interstate 10 highway sign can be found, and we can safely assume that the plantation house is stationed somewhere along the Mississippi River. So, while we can't be 100% accurate, we can reasonably predict that Swamp Fever is somewhere in the vicinity of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which means that the pilot at the end of Dark Carnival traveled over 400 miles before eventually crashing in the swamp, way further than the No Mercy pilot mentioned earlier. Pinning down an exact time frame is a bit difficult, but if I had to guess, the pilot at the end of Dark Carnival turned roughly 2 to 4 hours after picking up the survivors. Now that we've laid all of that out, let's analyze this in more detail. First of all, these infected survivors turned in under 24 hours. The Dark Carnival pilot lasted the longest out of all the examples provided, and that was 3 to 4 hours at the most. The time to turn, as shown already, is wildly inconsistent, and it differs from person to person. While it's not 100% confirmed, we can safely assume that the time to turn can vary based on multiple different factors. The type of injury and location of the wound should be taken into consideration, along with other smaller factors like age, gender, and overall health of the infected individual. Another theory suggests that the turning process can differ depending on the mental state of the infected victim. It may seem like a stretch, but we know that the green flu virus has devastating effects on the human brain. Anything from stress to anxiety can perhaps speed up the turning process. Let's use the church guy as an example. When you meet the church guy for the first time, he can be heard quietly talking to himself. He's obviously in distress, but it's nothing super out of the ordinary, until the survivors knock on the door and his demeanor completely changes. He then begins yelling hysterically, threatening the survivors and attempts to kill them by ringing the bell. Very shortly after, you can hear the church guy turning into a zombie. Another example is Zoe's mother Carolyn, who has one of the fastest transformations we've seen in the Left 4 Dead universe. At the start of Zoe's flashback, Wade and Carolyn are having a full-blown argument. Their heated exchange is interrupted by a zombie entering the room and attacks Carolyn by biting her on the face. The location of the bite is very close to her brain, which likely sped up the turning process. As mentioned earlier, Zoe's mom would turn in just a couple of seconds after being bit. Carolyn was already very agitated, just like the church guy. Infected victims who suffer from severe anxiety or depression could experience faster turn rates. However, the theory is lacking any substantial evidence. It's still a very interesting rabbit hole that's worth a discussion. The common infected are very dangerous, as proven by the sheer damage done to the state of Pennsylvania in just 2 weeks. And if that wasn't bad enough, the infected hordes were about to become much stronger. The Special Infected made their first appearance 2 weeks after the first infection. These infected variants were much deadlier than the common infected, and they all suffered from horrific mutations, drastically altering their physical appearance and granting them unnatural abilities. Let's go over each of these Special Infected and analyze the extent of their mutations. We're also going to discuss a ton of different theories, so let's get into it. Let's start with the Smoker. The Smoker serves as the Infected's long-range attacker, a towering and intimidating Infected with a deadly method of attack. This Infected uses his very large tongue to ensnare and immobilize survivors. If the Smoker grabs hold of its victim, it will attempt to pull the survivor in, and if successful, the Smoker will unleash a fury of punches until the victim is dead. Alternatively, the Smoker will just choke the survivors until they die of asphyxiation. The Smoker's physical appearance is extremely grotesque, even when compared to his infected brothers and sisters. The Smoker's face is riddled with tumor-like growths, which expels a dark green gas that follows the Smoker wherever he goes. On top of that, the Smoker actually has multiple tongues, 6 to be exact. These extra tongues do not affect the gameplay, but it's still worth pointing out. One theory worth a mention is that the Smoker's tongue isn't actually his tongue, but instead his intestines. This does make sense, since the human intestines can be anywhere from 15 to 26 feet in length, and this can be very easily extended by the virus's mutations. Another popular theory is that smokers were originally cancer patients, or, of course, heavy smokers, evidenced by the countless tumors, the coughing, and the green smoke being emitted at almost all times. While they're not the most intimidating of the special infected, smokers are still very deadly and pose a significant threat to any lone survivor. The smoke cloud and heavy coughing are early warning signs that you are being watched by something, and if you aren't quick enough, you'll already be ensnared and torn apart. The smoker is not the most lethal of the infected, but their efficacy cannot be understated. Up next is the Hunter, a stealthy predator who has been granted unnatural agility and athleticism. At a first glance, the Hunter doesn't look like a special infected. His eyes and skin are heavily damaged, but that's to be expected. Some survivors may mistakenly assume that the Hunter is a common infected, but his ability is anything but normal. The Hunter can leap very high into the air and pounce on survivors, pinning them to the ground and dealing heavy damage with their claws. Additionally, the Hunter can wall jump and use his leaping ability to evade survivors. According to Lieutenant Mora's extraction report, the Hunter can jump as high as 30 feet. Important to keep in mind that this number is likely higher. Of all the special infected, none are as fast and as agile as the Hunter. On top of that, the Hunter is also very quiet. An audible growl is one of the only warnings you have, and if you don't react fast enough, you will be torn apart in a matter of seconds. If you take a look at the Hunters, you can see duct tape wrapped around their arms and legs. Parkourists use this in real life to prevent wind resistance. Before their zombification, Hunters were perhaps athletes or parkourists, which is a possible explanation for the Hunter's superhuman agility. These people already had a very high level of agility and endurance, and this was possibly spiked by the green flu's mutations, which allows them to leap at superhuman distances. This is obviously speculation, but super interesting nonetheless. Before moving on to the next special infected, I wanted to point out another theory, and that's the possibility that the Hunters actually hunt in packs. This is another theory that only has one piece of concrete evidence, but it's still super interesting. At the beginning of the Sacrifice trailer, we can see a pack of Hunters watching the survivors from behind a boat. They aren't relentlessly attacking each other, but instead stalking in unison. It's unclear if the special infected have a way of communicating with each other, but if they do have a method of communication, it's perhaps limited to the special infected. Again, it's lacking substantial evidence, but it's still an interesting rabbit hole. Up next is the Boomer, a classic special infected that serves as their primary support. Boomers are very slow and lack any high damage abilities. What they do have is their vomit, that blinds survivors and attracts the common infected. The blindness from the bile usually leads to panic, and it makes the survivors easy targets for other special infected. Boomers are obviously very bloated, and they aren't exactly subtle, so catching a team of survivors off guard is a difficult task. When killed, the boomers will explode, only leaving behind the lower half of their body. Any survivors caught in the explosion will be covered in bile. Additionally, boomers are the only special infected to have a male and female variant. One theory suggests that boomers were morbidly obese before contracting the virus, and the mutations bloated them into the monstrosities that we see in-game. Boomers are viewed as the weakest special infected, with their lack of immediate damage and fragile bodies, but they are still very dangerous. If you're careless around a boomer, you will face the consequences. Of all the special infected in the game, witches are among the deadliest and the most complex. They are much different than the rest of the infected cast. Witches do not relentlessly chase or silently stalk like other infected. Instead, they cry, covering their face while doing so. Sometimes they can be seen walking around, sometimes they're sitting down. A witch will only attack a survivor if she is disturbed or directly provoked, and if this happens, the results are often devastating. When enraged, the witch will scream and relentlessly pursue the survivor that disturbed her. She will not stop until she is dead or the survivor is killed. Even setting her on fire will not stop her pursuit. The witch's primary attack is her massive claws. Some have speculated that these claws are overgrown fingernails, others suggest that they are instead sharpened bone. Either way, these claws are very deadly, and they can instantly down survivors with a single swipe. Even in a downed state, the witch will not stop, relentlessly clawing at the downed survivor until they are dead. An interesting detail about the witch is what happens when she successfully kills a survivor. When a survivor is killed by the witch, she'll look around frantically for a few seconds before covering her face and sprinting away from the survivors, hysterically crying the entire time. Even when being shot at, she will continue to run away. This would once again imply that the infected do have a sense of self-preservation. In the case of the witch, the effects of the virus seem to be a lot more psychological than physical. It's possible that witches were extremely depressed, and this was only amplified by the effects of the green flu, which explains their constant crying and state of distress. Other theories suggest that the crying is instead used to lure in survivors, which is exactly what happens in the intro cinematic for Left 4 Dead 1. Of all the special infected, the witch just might be the most mysterious, and that makes her even scarier. If you hear the cries of a witch, it's best to leave her alone. Jockeys were first spotted 3 weeks after the first infection. Their ability is similar to the hunters, with a few key differences. The jockey can leap very high into the air and jump on survivors' heads, clawing at their face and steering them in whatever direction they desire. They cannot jump as high as the hunter, but their mobility is still way better than most other infected. Despite their small size, jockeys are surprisingly durable, boasting a health pool of 325, which is higher than all the infected mentioned so far with the exception of the witch. The two most notable things about the jockey are his small size and his hysteric laughter. The jockey is constantly hunched over. The spinal cord is obviously damaged by the mutations of the virus. Some have speculated that jockeys were perhaps the elderly or someone with spinal conditions that were worsened by the effects of the green flu. A much darker theory suggests that jockeys are instead infected children, though it's important to note that this theory is lacking any concrete evidence aside from the jockey's small size. Another characteristic of the jockey is their constant twitching. Even in their idle states, the jockey is very jittery, constantly moving his arms, legs, and body in a very frantic manner. The lips of the jockey are also completely removed, showing a set of sharp and bloody teeth. It's unclear if the jockey bit off his own lips or tore it apart with his bare hands. Regardless of the reason, it's one of the most unsettling parts about this infected. A very interesting detail about the jockey can be found in the developer commentary for Left 4 Dead 2, where it directly states that the reason for the jockey's constant laughter is because the green flu has left their brain in a state of, and I quote, hysterical mania. Jockeys are very dangerous, and work best when attacking with other special infected. They may be small, but they are among the most lethal of the infected. Stay with your team and don't stray too far, unless you want to get carried away and torn apart by the infected hordes. Spitters are another female-specific variant. Serving as the infected's long-range support, the spitter can launch a ball of acid that deals heavy damage to the survivors. Similar to the boomer, the spitter is very fragile, with a health pool of 100. A couple of well-aimed shots is all you need to take her down. The spitter is also among the most grotesque of the special infected. Taking a closer look at the spitter, we can see immense damage done to her face, more specifically her mouth, which is open at all times. This, along with other damage done to the face, was likely caused by constant exposure to the acidic substance seen leaking out of her mouth. Interestingly enough, the spitter seems to be resistant to the harmful effects of her own acid, at least to some degree. This acidic substance is being stored somewhere in her body, and the fact that it hasn't torn apart all of her internal organs seem to imply some kind of natural resistance, but again, it's hard to know the exact reasoning. When the spitter is killed, she leaves behind a small puddle of acid that damages any survivor that walks over it. There are of course plenty of theories about who the spitter was pre-zombification. One popular theory suggests that spitters were drug addicts or individuals with pre-existing stomach conditions that were mutated by the effects of the virus. Regardless of the origin, the mutations of the spitter are among the most disgusting and deadliest of the infected cast. The spitter has a small health pool, but her sheer lethality and damage makes her a force to be reckoned with. The Charger is another special infected who made his first appearance 3 weeks after the first infection. The most notable thing about this special infected is of course his massive right arm, which also serves as his primary method of attack. As the name suggests, the Charger attacks by charging into survivors using his massive arm as a battering ram. Any survivor hit by the charge will be slammed into a wall, and the Charger will then smash their bodies into the ground over and over again until they are dead. If multiple survivors are hit by a single charge, they will be sent flying into the air. Additionally, the Charger is one of the only special infected who cannot be shoved by survivors. This infected's sheer brutality is often overlooked. Most other special infected rely on their teeth, claws, or some other harmful ability. Chargers instead rely on their immense physical strength, crushing a survivor's body until their bones are rendered to dust. It may not be the most graphic death in this universe, but it's still a horrifying way to go. There are a lot of interesting details about the Charger that deserves analysis, but I wanted to focus on two in particular. First is the Charger's left arm. The right arm of the Charger is of course massive and overgrown. If you take a look at the Charger's left arm, however, it's visibly withered to the point of complete uselessness. Before their zombification, Chargers were perhaps victims who suffered from severe muscle imbalance or steroid use, which could explain the overgrown right arm. Another popular theory suggests that Chargers spent their free time doing, well, other activities. Additionally, the Charger's vocalizations sound oddly human when compared to the other infected. Of course, this hasn't been confirmed, but when you listen to the Charger's vocalization sounds, you can almost make out actual coherent words. Take a listen for yourself. As mentioned earlier, this hasn't been confirmed, but it's still interesting and worth pointing out. Because of the Charger's massive size and insane physical strength, their lethality is not to be understated. Be cautious and stay on your toes, especially when hanging around cliffs and rooftops. No special infected in Left 4 Dead is as dangerous as the tank, a terrifying, massive zombie that is completely unmatched in raw physical strength. This special infected uses his massive arms to punch survivors, which deals massive damage. The tank can also rip concrete right out of the ground and chuck it at survivors with deadly precision. If there are any nearby dumpsters, cars, or forklifts, the tank can use these against the survivors, punching them with his massive arms and sending them flying towards the survivors, which usually ends with an immediate death or incapacitation. Because of his massive size, the tank is slow and can be easily killed under the right circumstances. However, if he gets within arm's reach of a survivor, the result is often death. The tank's massive amount of muscle also acts as a shield. His health pool is by far the largest in the game, and depending on the difficulty, he can down survivors with a single punch. The tank is in a constant state of unbridled rage, and will attack the first survivor he sees without a second thought. The tank will move or destroy anything that gets in their way. Walls, cars, or even other infected. It doesn't matter. When in pursuit, the tank is nearly unstoppable. One interesting detail about this special infected is the fact that he seems to taunt or celebrate when fighting the survivors. When the tank lands a punch, he can be seen beating his chest like a gorilla. Similarly, if the tank kills a full team of survivors, he can be seen shuffling around and punching the air, almost as if he's celebrating his victory, which is a trait that isn't seen in any other infected. Before contracting the green flu, tanks were perhaps bodybuilders or individuals who used a high amount of steroids. The green flu spiked their muscle growth, specifically in the upper body, turning them into the hulking figures we see in-game. Regardless of the origin, the tank is by far the deadliest infected in the game. A full team of survivors is needed to take one down, and even then, survival is not guaranteed. Be fast on your feet, work together with your team, and if all goes well, you might just survive the tank's vicious onslaught. Now that we've gone over all the special infected, let's take a second to analyze any common traits and abnormalities. The first thing of note is how each special infected is different in how they approach and attack survivors. Hunters and smokers are stealthy predators who stalk from a distance. Tanks and chargers are mindless aggressors who charge in headfirst without a second thought. Spitters and boomers act as support, and the witch serves as a deceptive trap of sorts, luring in survivors and tearing them apart. The special infected also show a level of intelligence higher than the common infected. Pipe bombs are ignored by the special infected. They are still attracted to the noise, but they don't mindlessly attack the source in the same way the common infected do. Another example of the special infected's high level of intelligence can be found in the intro cinematic for Left 4 Dead 1. Lewis is seen chasing after a helicopter, while a hunter stalks him from the rooftops. The hunter quietly follows until Lewis is separated from the rest of the survivors, and when he's all alone, the hunter makes his move. And this is just one of many different examples. Jockeys will steer survivors into spitter puddles or environmental hazards. Tanks will use cars, dumpsters, and rubble as an alternate method of attack. Most of the special infected also received enhanced physical strength, and this goes beyond the obvious examples like the tank and the charger. Witches can break down doors and down survivors with a single swipe of their claws. This smoker in the Sacrifice comic gets a hold of one of Lieutenant Mora's soldiers, and after a couple of seconds, this is the end result. This soldier's skull was completely crushed by the smoker's bare hands. The special infected are incredibly dangerous, and is one of the core reasons why the green flu is as dangerous as it is. There is a ton of mystery surrounding the special infected and their origins, and while it's always fun to speculate and theorize, the true answer will likely never be revealed, but through context clues and other in-game hints, we can at least try to gain a better understanding of the virus and its horrific mutations. The origin of the green flu has never been revealed, and likely never will. However, by looking at in-game hints and environmental storytelling, we can at least theorize about the true origins of this mysterious virus. Over the years, there have been plenty of popular theories that deserve their own videos. Some say that the green flu was a failed bioweapon that was accidentally released into the public. Some theorize that the green flu was instead an experimental vaccine that has devastating effects on the human body. Some theories even suggest that the virus was delivered to Earth by aliens. These are all interesting theories, but they are lacking any concrete or substantial evidence, at least in my opinion. One of the most popular theories states that the green flu is a mutated strain of the rabies virus, and of all the potential possibilities, this one is, in my opinion, the most credible. Animals infected with rabies display many harrowing symptoms, one of them being agitation or hyper-aggressive behavior, which is a trait that practically defines the common infected. Also of note are the dead cows found in some of the Left 4 Dead campaigns. If you take a look at their heads, the skin around the skull has been completely removed, a clear sign that a rabies test was conducted. You can also find these posters in Dead Air, telling survivors to report to airport security if they kept or handled livestock in the last 48 hours. CEDA had no understanding of how the virus worked and how it transmitted, and because of this, the livestock was culled and tested. These piles of dead cows we see in the Left 4 Dead campaigns perhaps played a part in transmitting the virus, or it's the potential origin for the virus itself. Like I said multiple times already, the true origin of the virus will likely never be revealed, and that mystery is what makes the green flu so incredibly interesting. By delving into the game's lore, we can theorize and piece together how this virus came into existence, and discuss the horrifying mutations and monstrosities that the virus has created. The point of this video was to highlight the true severity of this fictional virus, and I hope I did a good job. The green flu has so many different layers and components that make it an almost unstoppable force of nature. The inconsistent method of transmission, the horrifying symptoms, and the sheer brutality of the common and special infected are all key reasons why I think the green flu is one of, if not the deadliest virus we've seen in fictional media. Hi guys, sorry for the wait on this video. It's been a very confusing year to say the least, but moving forward I am going to be more consistent on uploads. This video was a lot of fun to make, and also long overdue. Over a year ago, I discussed CEDA and the military's failure to contain the virus, so now it feels fitting to talk about the virus itself. Once again, I'm deeply sorry for the wait, and I will be uploading more consistently from here on. So, with that said, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.